Sami is Swiss, which you hear when he speaks German, but you don't really hear when he speaks English. So I'll have to tell you that. He got his MA equivalent from the University of Bern. He got his doctorate from the University of Bern in Switzerland. And he got his Habilitation, Switzerland being one of the few countries that, like Germany, has a Habilitation from the University of Bern in Switzerland. But he's not in Switzerland any longer, where he was also a senior assistant at the English department in the 1990s, and in fact, 2003. With a year at Harvard, a year at Riverside, and another year at Berkeley before that in the 90s. And then he became Professeur des Universités at the Université de Haute-Alsace in Mulhouse. And that's a particularly nice thing for us here in Freiburg, because that way, and with the university in Mulhouse, he is one of our partners in the UCOR system. And Sami is one of the real partners there, and in fact, as far as I'm concerned personally, he's one of the few people I call friends. Now, as a university professor, you get colleagues, but you don't get many friends, because usually you're vying for the same grants and the same stipends and the same pork barrels full of money. So there are a few friends there, and Sami is definitely one of them. He's one of the few genuinely friendly and cooperative people that I know in my own field in the university system. And we got to know each other a bit better at the EAAS conference in Nicosia in 2006, and have been, he's one of the motors of the one of the engine houses, powerhouses behind the whole ICOR system and the cooperation between the universities in Basel, Mulhouse, Strasbourg, and Freiburg.
For English only.
For English only, yeah, of course. Most recent publication gives you an idea of the bandwidth. I already mentioned Maxine Hong Kingston, so African and Asian American studies is one of his fields. Another one is early American drama, and that's one area where we cooperate and have common interests. And the other one is American realism, where he is one of the really good and interesting specialists on the topic of today, which is William Dean Howells. And then you can actually have the floor all for yourself. Samuel Matthias, better known as Sami Ludwig.
Yes, thank you, Wolfgang, for this very kind introduction. If you look for me as Sami, you know, it's probably easier on the internet, because I'm using this fairly strange Swiss short form of Samuel, because, you know, there's very few other people in the business who use that kind of name. So let me try to figure out how to use, yes, here, my talk. So you should see a slide now. And if there's a problem, I want Damaris who start wave her hands and complain and all that. So basically, I am not a Stephen Crane specialist, but I'm very much interested in realism and in what realism means. And usually people call Stephen Crane a naturalist. And so realism is something else. So my question today is, what is the realism of the realists about? And I try to overcome some of the simplifications that we hear about that. The naturalists didn't like the realists. They said they're kind of boring people, and they're not facing the dirty facts of hard life. And so there are words like hard facts, determinism, biology, sociology, objectivity involved in definitions of naturalism. All of this is not really very important for realism. Realism has been made fun of by the people who came later and being considered old-fashioned. And the famous American naturalist Frank Norris has talked about the drama of the broken teacup, basically insinuating that realism is extremely boring. It takes them absolutely forever to debate, you know, the smallest issues, and they don't really have anything to say. And he's of course right that in realism you have these endless conversations, you have lots of human interaction, but that's basically because knowledge for the realists is made in communication. It's not just, you know, the objective facts, but it has a lot to do with people who are communicating. All of this has to do with my book, which I wrote on realism, which has to do with pragmatism. I called it Pragmatist Realism. And it basically goes back to the friendship between the major mainstream realists or white realists, Henry James, William Dean Howells, and Mark Twain. And all of these three fairly different authors were very good friends with William James, who was himself at the heart of a new type of American philosophy, which is called pragmatism. And basically my approach was, and I guess still is, that American realism is fairly psychological in the sense of American psychology, Jamesian psychology, American pragmatism, and that this creates a fairly complex epistemological model of reality. Damaris, can you understand me? Yes, okay. So basically, for example, post-structuralists do not believe that we can get in touch with reality. They don't think that we can really, as Mark Twain would say, Mark Twain, that we can, you know, feel the ground somewhere. Il n'y a pas de hors texte. There are only signifiers. Realists don't really believe in that. Okay. One of the realists I looked at is Samuel Clemens, which is Mark Twain, and who made these very sophisticated efforts of mapping the ever-changing fluid meanderings of the Mississippi. What I'm trying to say is that reality is fluid, and you have to basically navigate reality, and sometimes you hit ground, sometimes you are getting contact with reality in a very complicated way. You have multiple contacts, and then you basically gain knowledge from that. This is why, according to me, the Mississippi is in many ways an allegory of how to find knowledge, or the behavior that Mark Twain shows as a pilot of the Mississippi. He has this famous book, All Times on the Mississippi, where he basically talks about what it means to be a pilot of the Mississippi and how to navigate reality. Okay, sorry, I'm messing up things. So now my case is William James. But before I talk about William James, I want to make clear to my audience that in my opinion, everybody wants to have realism. So to say the realists are into realism is of course a bit naive, because everybody believes that he has a finger in the pie and has an edge on reality. So the Egyptians, they had mummies because they believed there was a life after death. The Greeks, they had Platonism because you have the allegory of the cave, and they believed that there is a reality, you know, in concepts that prefigures, in a sense, the physical reality. Christians also believed in the other world, and they believed in a framework of monotheism that is, you know, outside of this physical reality, and that is very centered. So what they bring in to the ball game is a logocentric universe. And as you know, St. John, in the Gospel of John, we read, in the beginning was the Word. So basically Logos is in the beginning, and the Word was with God. So basically we have a metaphysics that is centered and top down. With the arrival of what is called early modernism or modern humanism and the Enlightenment and movements like that, we certainly have an influence of what is called natural science. People are taking, they're looking closely at nature. And I consider this a bottom-up method where you basically find the evidence for reality in an observation of nature. And it's no longer simply a top-down interpretation or hermeneutics that starts with certain truths that everybody believes in. Now, this is a different methodology. It basically is empirical. And what happened actually is that the early natural scientists who tried to get objective reality from experience, they did, however, imitate the centered metaphysical universe, which is basically the reason why some people who talk about positivism or, objective knowledge always believe that there is like this one centered universe. But this was basically just an imitation of what they expected to find, because before, the Christian medieval worldview was also logocentric and centered. But of course, the experiences are going all over the place. And the result is that we find out that when we really look at experiences, this mechanical universe that the early Enlightenment was expecting doesn't work. So the Romanticists basically invent, or they start getting interested in psychology, in a mental type of experience. But let me also point out that somebody like Emerson, for example, has his transcendentalist philosophy, and he still uses images like circles or circumference, where basically he says nature is all the reality we have. It's very important, but it's all surrounded, centered, controlled by some kind of God. So the universe is also a monologic type of situation. Inside and outside overlap, but all of this is totalizing. And the German version of the optimism of Emerson is probably the kind of romantic Weltschmerz, where people, are feeling in their individual emotions for the whole world, because these things are supposed to totally overlap. I think realism brings in something new that is quite important. At least in America, it comes after Romanticism. The realists are looking at specific historical contexts. They're looking at different experiences. And certainly we have new issues because society is divided into classes. We have experiences of industrialization. We do have the very important experience of the Civil War, which basically corrects many of these naive romantic misunderstandings about, the glorification of warfare. Realism basically shows that there's a lot of difference. It shows that there is racism. It looks at minorities, and it is in that sense a kind of aesthetic framework that is an early organization of multiculturalism. It has, for example, regionalism, different places in the United States. It believes in local color. The different places have a different culture. And what is very important here is that it's not only geography, but it's also social groups, minorities. And this is the time when we start having, official voices, printed literature by Jewish people, by Black people, by Native Americans. Late in the 19th century, you have Asian Americans, etc. So realism basically knows about pluralism. It's no longer a monologic kind of framework, but the challenge of realism then is, how do you keep all of this together? How do you make society not drift apart? I hope you realize that this is a question that is very important nowadays. The Americans also have a kind of divided society at this moment in the post-Trump culture. And this is in a sense a challenge that the realists also felt very much so. Now, since I don't have that much time, I'm just going to go over the other types of realists, realities very quickly. Naturalism basically implies that there is not a lot of bourgeois, that not everybody has the freedom of the bourgeois situation where you can express yourselves. And so they're very often people who have no voice. So when the realists collect all the voices, they forget some people. And so what is important are subtexts very often that control people's lives, people's behavior, be they determinism of biology, determinism of social class, etc. There are certain hard structures which offer limitations, but you guys will learn a lot more about that when you listen to all of these lectures and you find out about Stephen Crane, etc. Okay. Modernism basically, again, looks at all of these structures, but they realize that the structures are fragmented. Things fall apart is one of these famous modernist statements. So they have yet again a different attitude towards what is called reality. And the most complicated theory that appears at one point is called phenomenology. That shows up in the early 20th century, the time of modernism, which is basically something that fuses concept and percept. And as a result, the sign is the only thing that is objective. How do I get there? Think about painting, which is non-figurative. That is a very typical modernist kind of thing. You certainly have blobs of culture that are somewhere, of color that are somewhere. And that basically means that, there's no transparency in the signs. The signs do not show beyond the sign, but basically the color that is on the canvas simply is the color. So modernism, in a sense, offers you a third choice between, physical outside reality and concepts by saying the sign is the only thing that is real. In Dada, for example, they make fun of this. They have all of these signs that are totally meaningless, and they're celebrating this and they're exposing this. I think that is extremely interesting. So this is, in a sense, the period of semiotics, new art forms, and I think modernism is wonderful art. I have a much harder time with modernist philosophy. Post-structuralism, in many ways, is continuing this because, as you know, the sign is decentered. Okay, that makes sense because we've already had pluralism 100 years earlier, but basically they're fetishizing the oppositional differences. And they're basically focusing on signs only, but the signs are not referential, and therefore they don't have much of a direction. You don't really know what the signs mean because there is officially no world outside the sign, and you have the same issue in postmodernism. So basically, and let me be superficial and fast about it and quick about this. Basically, the idea is that realism at a later stage, at least these were the people who were big names when I was a young student, okay, they're basically denying referentiality. Reality is somewhere else. There are only simulacra, only symbols, for example. And you realize that today in our digital reality, we have people like, the Facebook guy in Facebook, they talk about the metaverse. And basically all of this is about representations. So they emphasize very much the non-real, and by emphasizing the non-real, they are, of course, still very much concerned with reality. So this is just my very short survey to explain to you that the realists are not the only ones who care about reality. Everybody cares about reality, but everybody defines it in ways that are different. Oh gosh, here I have another slide about post-structuralism. Okay, so basically the linguistic turn, again, the sign, you only have language, and Nietzsche, the truth in the extra-moral sense, which basically means that, again, language is not referring anywhere, and the moral reality, do you remember morality in the old hermeneutics means quod agas in Latin, what you're supposed to do, behavior. And what is interesting is that somebody like Nietzsche does not believe in this. Anyway, anti-realism. I don't want to get into the details. And now you even have people who talk about post-humanism. What I don't understand about the post-humanists is how they can deny their own epistemic center and basically get knowledge that is extra-human or post-human. You know, that is very, very difficult. Can you do that at all? Anyway, this is not my discussion, but again, reality is shifting, changing, etc., etc. My point is the realism of realism. So I'm introducing to you a man called William Dean Howells. Dean is his middle name, and he was called the Dean of American Realism. My point here is that historical realism is not naive, it's complex, it's interactional, it's constructed exactly like the post-structuralist reality, but the construction is a construction among or between human beings. So basically, it does have a referentiality. It involves different minds, different cognitions. It's an epistemology of human minds who all have different experiences and who have to calibrate their interactions. The book I want to talk about is A Hazard of New Fortunes, which basically makes, which faces New York City. It's basically a book about the mega city. Howells, who came from New England, from Boston, moved at one point to New York, and he was confronted with this mega city. What is life like in a mega city? How does all of this connect? It does connect. Everybody is living so closely together. But what about knowledge? Whose knowledge is important? What about social justice? Howells is totally overwhelmed by New York. New York is gigantic. It's humongous. And he tries to come to grips with it. So let me give you a very, very short summary of this, in my opinion, absolutely brilliant and very important novel, and one of the important central pieces in American realist literature. The story is about Basil and Isabel March, who are a kind of alter ego of Howells and his family. And he's able to make fun of these people sometimes. They have all kinds of, they make statements, they have impressions, and this makes it possible for Howells to explore certain ideas and to be sometimes also ironic about some ideas that he probably also believes in, which means he's able to laugh at himself and his wife, at his family to some extent. Anyway, so they move from Boston to New York, exactly like Howells himself did at one point. And the first 100 pages of the book, they're looking for an apartment. So this is all about finding my place in New York. It's very difficult. And Isabel says, New York terrifies me. So this is the complex new thing. Basil has a new job. He becomes editor of a new literary project of a literary journal called Every Other Week that combines words and images, and that is supposed to be produced in a different way, because the people are not just hired, but they own shares in this project. Note that every other week, it's a bi-weekly, which implies a dialogue back and forth. So there's a kind of interaction in the very title of the work that is important. Now, this project should actually create a representation that contains many different perspectives. So basically the pluralism of realism, a society divided into many, many different groups, is thus somehow represented in this panopticon, not in the Foucauldian sense, but in this kind of collection of multiple perspectives. That's exactly the challenge. How do you represent all the social groups? So one important participant is the man who pays for all of this. He's called the angel, and he is an oil plutocrat. There's somebody who has lots of money and he owns every other week. Again, think about how important this is as an idea, because it anticipates a man called Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post today. So today you also have American newspapers, important newspapers, that are being owned by, super rich robber barons. So this is basically really interesting, because some of the predicaments, some of the problems that Howells discusses in this text are still very, very important. Then there's a man called Beaton, who is the painter. He stands for the visual contribution. And he has a female student called Alma, who is much more intelligent, first in love with him, and then he dumps her, and then we find out that she's actually a better artist than he is, etc., etc. Basil March, whom we've just heard about, is responsible for the text, for writing. So it's all about pictures and texts and how to evaluate them. Then you have an interesting character called Lindau, who is a German immigrant and a communist. So he represents the proletariat and the foreigners, who also have to find a space in this world of representation, because they live in New York. So they should also be a part of the new magazine. You have some people who are involved in religion to help the poor. So there are a couple of characters who are into the social gospel. And then curiously, there's even one gentleman who comes from the South and who represents, the post-Civil War South, arguing that slavery actually was a more beneficial kind of system than the hard American capitalism, where poor workers are being exploited. So in a sense, the idea is to also have the Southern perspective at least included to some extent in this magazine. And there are many social receptions, contacts where other voices come in. But of course, if you look at this as a representation of American society, you clearly have gaps. Howells didn't know everybody, and he had to just represent the kind of people he had contact with, and that he felt that he could say something about. Okay, so what is my point today? I want to tell you about the L train experience. This is the really important element in the experience that I think is useful. The L train means the elevated train. And you have to realize that before New York had a subway, the train was elevated, and you would basically travel through the city. And I hope you can see that you could look into all the windows. So this is very interesting. You can still find the L train in some places in New York. For example, if you go to the Brooklyn Zoo, at one point the subway goes out of the ground, and then suddenly it's over the ground, and you can see the whole city, and you can go to the zoo. So I really recommend that to you if you ever want to go sightseeing in New York. So what is important is that very early on, early on chapter 8, but you know, it's a long book. Basically, they're talking about New York, and there are all of these experiences on the L roads. The L roads present the triumph over their prostate forms with a savage exaltation that is intoxicating. You see the bends, they're exciting, you know, they're totally picturesque, and you can look at the city all the time. March doesn't believe it. He thinks this is so amazing. It's a kind of panopticon. You can see everything all the time. But I hope you realize Howells is making fun of his protagonist. And you notice there are no real street encounters. New York is gay, and they even say you can forget death in New York. The problem is Isabel at one point has a nightmare about something hideous that has no mouth. And I think this is an interesting image because it shows you that the picturesque facade, you know, is an object that is looking at a subject, and it's not really different subjects that are interacting in a dialogue. It's a one-sided kind of affair, and this is the main point that Howells is making. Howells is worried about this image, which has no voice, which is just appropriated, looked at, and that is a problem. He actually says, you know, in the old days, I loved this picturesque stuff. I was looking at all of these, the poverty in Naples or in Florence, and I had what he calls a purely aesthetic view of this. He likes travel writing and all that, but he says, this is a problem because now I live in New York. The poor people are just down the block. Sometimes he can smell them. And actually, Basil becomes a little bit sarcastic about what he sees. And he says in one beautiful quote, I wonder what they, you know, the people, the poor people in the tenement houses, what they think of us making this gorgeous progress through their midst. So he's able to imagine that there's possibly also another perspective somewhere. And I hope you can see here the word progress, which is being used and also used in a very cynical way, because there is no real progress. It's just some people who are privileged. At one point, he meets a decently dressed man. He looks good, but he's starving, and he catches March's hand when he gives him $1, okay? And suddenly this reality that is merely visual grabs him. It's a physical kind of thing. This is very, very interesting. So in a sense, this is what I would call deconstructing mimicry. Mimicry is not good enough. You know, there's a kind of connection. Anyway, so the question is, how do you represent this big city? It's too big. It's so many people, so many perspectives. And this is why I think some of the descriptions that he gives when he is riding on the elevated train are very similar to what I consider what is Cubism in modernism. The question now is, what is Cubism? Cubism is basically when you have many perspectives side by side, but they never connect in a single perspective. It's something very complicated. I said here, objectivity beyond a single perspectivism or multiple human perspectives. So basically, it's visual, it's objective, but it does not connect the many perspectives. It contains multiple perspectives, but they're all broken up. It's a modernist kind of thing. And I believe that there are descriptions, and I'm going to show them to you, where Howells is actually using exactly this. So here's an example of modernism of Cubism. And you see basically it's all on the canvas in one image, but the image basically does not cohere. It's broken. you have these buildings. And the question is very often also, where is the perspective rooted? Of course, because we have multiple perspectives, there is no grounding of it, really. Here, just as an additional thing, more famous Cubist paintings. I have no idea why there are so many Cubist paintings with instruments, musical instruments. Probably because we have this visual experimentation. And the question is, where does sound come in? Sound is something else, right? You cannot paint sound, really, sort of, right? And I wonder, in a sense, why you have these references. But that's in many ways beyond my understanding. And human beings, you know, are also interesting. They do not really cohere. They're unnatural, and they're basically caught up into different faces and straight facades. Anyway, this is sort of something that interests me. So they're going back on the train because the train is so exciting, and there are many, many long quotations where you have them on the train and they're riding. So he says, at the 3rd Avenue, he took the elevated again, for which, oh no, that's she, Isabel confessed her infatuation. She now said that the night transit was even more interesting than the day, and that the fleeting intimacy you formed with people in 2nd and 3rd floor interiors had domestic intensity mixed with perfect repose. Repose means you don't worry about it. This is an exposure of voyeurism, even at night, more nightlife, intimacy, but you realize that the looks are basically short, superficial. And he, Basil, compares this immediately to the theater. It's like a performance, and you can look through people's windows. And he thinks that is really exciting. You see working class people, you see a woman sewing, you see a mother and a child, you see a man with his head fallen. So I hope you realize you have all of these poor people. You see a romance, a girl and her lover leaning over a windowsill together. What suggestion, what drama, what infinite interest. So there are all of these disconnected pictures, and Basil basically wonders, how can he report about New York? How can he write about New York? And he wants to do sketches. As you know, in literature, they talk about sketches, but you know, sketching is an image that comes from painting. So basically, it means, again, you go back to this visual type of voyeurism, which is extremely complicated. Again, at 42nd Street, they looked up and down the long stretch of the elevated north and south. The track had found, whoops, sorry, I can't read everything, found itself 1,000 times in the flare and tremble of the innumerable lights, the moony sheen, the electrics mixing with the reddish points and blots of gas far and near. So this is basically an image where all of these incoherent images are connected by the L train, by the machine. The machine is very important. I hope you realize here that this is basically tackling the problems of modernism. These are the type of experience that remind us of Fritz Lang's Metropolis. This is all about the machine, and then you have all of this reddish image too, which might stand for blood. I'm thinking of William Carlos Williams's wheelbarrow, you know, where you have the wheelbarrow technology, and you have the white chickens, and the wheelbarrow is red, so you also have red and white. So this is, in my opinion, something that anticipates a modernist type of idea, but it's not a modernist celebration of technology and steel as we would have it in the Italian futurism, nor is it an absolute modernist refusal of technology that you would have in you know, the high modernists, who basically have a tendency to reject technology. So here you see that, again, these are the rails that are connecting all of these many windows. And I hope you see that painters, also Cubist painters, are also into these rails. Anyway, there are all kinds of images. There's this incomparable perspective. They talk about this all the time. They call it a spectacle, which in a city full of painters nightly works its unrecorded miracles. So ultimately, this is something very, very visual. It's a spectacle. You may actually want to consult Guy Debord and the, the French type of postmodern spectacle, society of the spectacle, simulacrum culture. I think this is clearly something I would like to use sometimes when I talk about this. There's also the idea that the iron rail is something like a spider, a spider net that connects the city with all kinds of associations. And what is interesting is that they're just looking at this and they stand inarticulate before it. The problem is, how do you find words to express all of this? And when they stop at the central depot with the elevated train, they don't know, is this the place where all the people are controlled? This is very difficult. What is important is that this is clearly not an interactive network. They just stop at one point, and there is what I call no looking back. You know, it's a one-sided voyeurism. The people are not looking back. They're just objects. They're not also subjects who can look at me. So the issue is, in a sense, that there is what Aretha Franklin calls RESPECT. There is no respect. There is no looking back. And then the question is, again, this whole issue about what is it that connects people? So basically, again, they're on the train. Forces, fates were sweeping. You know, he's connecting, he's associating the train with Arabs and monsters, a resemblance of life, but not real life. And the question is, in a sense, also that when you're on the train, the world is moving and you are stable. This is really interesting. Some of you may know the famous Stephen Crane story about the bride who comes to Yellow Sky, where we have an opening scene of the couple on the train, where you have exactly that situation. Basically, the train is stable and the landscape is in a sense flowing past the train. And this is the kind of experience that Howells has as well. Okay. But he does not embrace this incoherent vision. Okay. So they're again on the train. They're on the train all the time. And I know I probably have limited time, so I will not give you all of these quotations in great detail. But he's basically, again, now he is in the train and he finds that inside the car, you also have other people who are traveling with him. And Basil March is discovering all of these other minorities and nationalities in New York. He compares this to a beehive. Again, the word picturesque is important because he's looking at them. He cannot cope with them yet. He's talking about people who look different, brilliant eyes, Jewish people, Southern Italians. And he's basically asking himself, you know, as to what notion these poor animals formed of a free republic from their experience of life under its conditions. This is very interesting. So he's basically, again, able to turn the tables and to sort of figure out to project what the other people might think about him and about this beautiful, free United States. Because he notes that many of these people are lower class, that are poor, but they're together in the car. He looks at their eyes. So basically there is a kind of visual interaction at least. And what I guard from this big text is also that they have certain notions. They may have certain opinions. So this is very, very important. March never entered a car without encountering some interesting shape of shabby adversity, which was almost always adversity of foreign birth. I want you to realize that there's, again, this criticism, this kind of this criticism voiced in the voice of the narrator against the narrator. We notice that he has prejudices. He's aware of them. So basically, the question is, what is their focalizer? We have statements about his own privilege, and we have this open question about empathy and how can he have empathy. So he travels on the east side where you have the poor people. He realizes that these minorities, Germans, Slavonic, Greeks, I guess, Mongolians, all of these people, are basically a large group, and they outvote the dominant race. Does anybody remember when Obama became president? People said, finally, we're going to have a minority president and all that. He's already thinking about this kind of politics. And it's interesting. We should discuss that sometimes. Why is it still so far away? So he's basically, discussing the furtive glitter of Italians, the blonde dullness of Germans, the cold quiet of Scandinavians, and thinking that every person basically has a personal history that can be reconstructed, but he's just dreaming about this. He doesn't know these people. We read, he did not take much trouble about this. What these poor people were thinking, hoping, fearing, enjoying, suffering, just where and how they lived, who and what, I guess, they individually were. So basically he's daydreaming, and he's not really in touch with them, but he's on the train racing along, looking at this. But the book itself, just by listing all of this, is of course showing the limitations and asking these questions. Okay. So have you noticed in this long quotation, we talk about the majority minority. There is basically, there are these minorities, but he finds out that they're actually more people than the bourgeois Anglo elite who are in power. He uses all kinds of racist descriptions, but I think it's exposed in irony. You have these alliterations that basically undermine this and expose these racist epithets as exactly what they are. They point out that these are just statements. Furtive glitter of Italians, cold, quiet Scandinavians. So basically, what is exposed is this speculation, the suggestion, and these projections that that the other people probably also make, but that he doesn't see. Very important. Gay ugliness, isn't that an interesting term? So in a sense, the whole gayness of New York that they looked at the beginning is slowly, changing its evaluation, its nature, it's different. And then they end at the shapeless, graceless, reckless picturesqueness of the Bowery. So even though he cannot interpret this, he projects into this vision of what he sees. He certainly cannot ignore it, and he's trying to think that, you know, they may also have certain opinions. Anyway, here is another example. Let's understand that the examples of what he sees on the L train are not always clearly moving forward in the interpretation of the experience. But here you have a wonderful example, a description where he talks about the theater. The railway basically is erasing the line across the Corinthian front of the old theater, almost grazing its fluted pillars and flouting in dishonored pediment. What is important is basically that he's connecting the railway to the theater, and he's thus, in a sense, exposing the vision that he has into all of these windows as something unreal, these vistas. So this is very interesting. The railroad wins the competition against the theater. There's something almost Disney-esque about this, because the real railroad is actually more suggestive than the theater, which is supposed to be suggestive. All of the vistas that he uses, you know, he uses the word vistas here, remind me of somebody called Walt Whitman, who writes about New York in all of these catalogs, all of these vistas. And Walt Whitman basically, you know, breathes in and out all of these images of New York. But Howells basically shows you that this is simply voyeuristic window watching, and the vistas that he talks about are much more problematic because they do not connect. Another reference I saw here is this artificial element of that reminds me a little bit of Hollywood as described by Nathaniel West. Anyway, all of this continues. This is a long description of all of these people who are being watched, a frantic panorama. Okay, he wonders at the forces at work. He sees there is no plan in all of this life, as the force of the forest from the soil to the sky. It's a fierce struggle for survival, with the stronger life persisting. The strong, the weak, the godless absence of intelligence, the huge disorder. And I hope you realize these are all images, concepts that we tend to associate with naturalism today. So what I want to say is that Howells knows about these things. He's basically using all of these concepts. He's presenting them, but he basically does not believe in them because he thinks there are basically visual things that are fairly superficial. So anyway, this is what I just said. In this quote, we find many naturalist ideas. We find social Darwinism. We find a structure that subjugates life. We find no plan, forces at work, survival. It's a godless world, a chaos of selfishness, etc., etc. So basically, when he gets out of the train, he feels fairly uncomfortable, and he doesn't really know what to do. With the sense of the neglected opportunities of painters in that locality, you know, painters can talk about this, but he's not happy about all of this painting issue. So in a sense, the problem is really, how do you represent, how do you illustrate all of these local studies, which become extremely intense. So local color in New York basically is doubly intense. Every window is a new vista, is a new perspective. And the question is, what do you do with this? It's all broken up. And what I think is interesting is that in Howells and in his book, the experience is more important than simply the representation. The contact is important. And we find in his story that Angus Beaton, the guy who is the visual artist, is actually not the good guy. He's quite a negative figure, which has to do with a kind of criticism against visual knowledge. For Howells, understanding reality, representing reality is not a matter of WYSIWYG. WYSIWYG is this concept that you know from computers. What you see is what you get. So basically, you can look for hours through all of these windows, but basically the knowledge that you gain doesn't help. It's projection. You're still ignoring people, and it's a chaos. So I see basically in these descriptions of the vision from the elevated train a kind of rejection of visual modernism. Modernism is very often considered to be a very visual mode, and this is basically something that Howells rejects. Okay, so again, he's talking about Naples, which used to be important, but he's no longer a tourist. That's the problem. And at one point, he talks about artists who should represent this, and he talks about the two arts, which is usually literature and painting, the visual and the verbal arts. And he's basically wondering, you know, how can I bring them together? This is extremely important. And we're already on page 160, blah, blah. And so he's taking the train and he's finally getting out of the train until he finds his old teacher, Lindau, who speaks with a heavy German accent. And so he encounters the other. This is more important, talking to the other person, even if the person has an accent. This is very, very important. Okay. More issues here about representation. We are already in part 4. You know, the pages are advancing, and he's still on the elevator train. There's an amazing infatuation here. He's describing what he sees. New York makes no sense. But the problem is that you tend to get used to certain experiences, and the experience becomes less individualistic. It becomes a kind of type, a generalization, or maybe an abstraction. Okay. What I think is important, careful, I'm getting lost here. I'm talking way too fast. Again, he's talking about how to interpret all of this information. So they is Mr. and Mrs. March, and they still have the same point of view, the same perspective. They look at this spectacle again, okay, but at the end we have this wonderful sense, wonderful statement: a sense of the striving and the suffering deeply possessed him, and this grew the more immense as he gained some knowledge of the forces at work. So what is the point here? The point here is that he moves from vision only to knowledge, and the knowledge obviously seems to be something that is hidden behind all of this spectacle. It's something else. So knowledge is basically not just on the surface, but it's somewhere else. And I think I want to now explain to you how he sees knowledge. I realize I've been racing through this extremely fast because I have way too many slides, and I totally apologize for this. But basically, the idea is that he is on the elevated train, he's looking at things all the time, and he's very uncomfortable about this because you need to have something beyond the visual, which is some kind of a reality. And I think if you want to know what is the answer to this feeling of being uncomfortable when you only look at the spectacle and you realize that you're a voyeur, we can find out about this in another book that has a very typical situation, and that is The Rise of Silas Lapham, another one of Howells's very famous novels. Okay, so I think The Rise of Silas Lapham is important because it gives us an example not only of what Howells criticizes as the unreal, the facade, the voyeurism, the spectacle, but at what he considers an important kind of knowledge. So that gives us an idea about what a realist like Howells considers to be reality. The Rise of Silas Lapham is about a businessman who is very, very rich. He's a nouveau riche. He's not very cultivated. And it's also about the clash of social classes, which we find, for example, wonderfully described in a dinner party on Beacon Hill, which is the best neighborhood in Boston, where the Corey family, you know, they're old Puritans, you know, they invite the new businessman Silas Lapham because they have a business connection. And basically there's this encounter of the Boston Brahmins and the Brahmins and the nouveau riche. And is this scene of the gloves, you know, where Silas Lapham is putting on gloves because he thinks you need to have fancy gloves when you're invited to Beacon Hill, and he makes a fool of himself. There's also a love story which is amazing. I'm just telling you this because it's such a great book, where basically Lapham's daughter Penelope falls in love with Tom Corey, who is the son of this old Boston family. And it's all about blindness because Penelope has a little sister called Irene, and everybody believes that Tom is in love with Irene, but he likes Penelope, who is not as pretty, but she got brains. She's an intelligent girl, and that's why he loves her. And then what is interesting is that at one point, they find out that this is what is the case. And then Penelope feels very guilty because her little sister Irene is also in love with Tom Corey, and she feels that she is taking away, you know, the lover from her little sister. And there is a touching, absolutely amazing conversation between these two sisters who, you know, clarify the situation and feel very sorry about hurting the other person. This is the best kind of realist dialogue that you can ever find. But that's not what I want to talk about. The reality that I want to talk about has to do with the bankruptcy of Silas Lapham. Silas Lapham is actually speculating. He's losing all of his money, and at the end, he's basically going bankrupt. And the novel is called The Rise of Silas Lapham because at the end, he loses his money, but he rises morally because he's doing the right thing. And when he's doing the right thing, his moral rise, what does that mean? This is the situation. He's learning about what is happening beyond what you see. So the main point in the conclusion of this novel is that reality goes beyond what you see is what you get. Okay, so he's basically able to think, and that's what the moral attitude is all about. He's able to think beyond the mere confusing facade. You need an imagination in order to understand the real. So what is happening? He would be able to sell worthless stock to English investors. So there's this group in England, and they would be willing to pay him lots of money for worthless real estate that he owns. And he would be able to just sell this to these people whom he doesn't know, who are anonymous. And then he would not have to declare bankruptcy. He would save his life. He would save the money of his family, etc. If he would accept the deal and just, make that deal, and that would be it. And he would be well off. But Silas Lapham basically decides not to sell this worthless real estate to these foreigners whom he doesn't know, because he understands that once this worthless paper arrives in England, the people in England are going to lose their money and their investment. So beyond what you really see, beyond what you really know, there is a consequence. And he's aware of that. And that is basically, for the realist Howells, the important point to make. You need imagination in order to touch the real, in order to really engage in reality, because reality is very often not visible, which basically means just the phenomena that you see, they do not help you. What you need is empathy. You need to be willing to understand the other. I think this is interesting, especially today, because today we have books like Against Empathy that are basically finger pointing and saying empathy just means that the people are projecting into the other. They don't really understand the other. They're just projecting. Empathy is wrong, because it's appropriating the attitude of the others. Howells basically has a different attitude here, because if you have no empathy, you're going to have another problem. You need to project at some point. So, like I said, realism is not just about objective reality, but it's about imagination, about imagining what reality is going to be like for the other people. I think this is extremely important today, because we have a globalist society, we have a globalist economy, and I think this is really interesting, because today we are shopping, we're ordering all kinds of things from Amazon, and we have no idea where it comes from. We have no idea how it was made. We have no idea about the pollution of all that. And in my opinion, some of these confusions that Howells presents in his complex image of New York, when he's looking through all of these windows, plus some of this effort to find a solution, because you have to imagine what would happen to the other people if I do this. All of this is about moral responsibility. And I think it's an attitude that today is extremely interesting, is extremely important. And it goes, of course, against the grain of some kind of an extra moral post-structuralist attitude. Anyway, as you can see, I have lots of questions when I'm throwing this elevated train and the images in your face, and sort of, what does it mean? Is this really a kind of connection of visuality that you can connect to Cubism? That is my suggestion. Is there really any sense in this anti-visual stance that we find in Howells? And ultimately also, I don't know if any of the irony that he's using with Basil and Isabel March, I don't know if any of this really came across or does come across to you. But I think what is interesting is that he always criticizes them, but he still loves them. He still loves these characters. And I think that's an interesting attitude. Anyway, I'm done. I hope we have some time for questions. I can hear Wolfgang.
Because I can possibly relay questions from the numerous audience in the lecture hall here.
Mm-hmm.
One I'd have to you, Sami, the
or
one
comments.
figure.
Or comments.
the one figure in Hazard of New Fortunes that's been most intriguing to me is that of Bernhard Lindau, of course, insofar as he's a 48er revolutionist. And I think he's actually based on a person that Howells knew personally, the former Civil War general August Willich.
He had a German teacher out there in Ohio, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
That's maybe the person.
How important would you say he is for an understanding of, I mean, the whole revolution of 48, 49 is something that's stuck between Romanticism and New Realism, really. So is this an allegorical figure, more or less, or how would you rate him?
That is difficult to say. I don't want to give you a final interpretation of this person, Lindau. What is important is as you observe, Howells is actually an interesting person because he comes from Ohio and he's one of the few Americans who are polyglot. You know, he speaks German and fluent German, fluent Italian, etc., and some French. So he's interesting in that sense, and clearly Lindau probably echoes or is modeled on this man who was, if I'm not mistaken, his German teacher when he was a young man in Ohio and when he learned German. Well, the interpretation of Lindau is fairly complicated. I mean, the thing that has been discussed a lot is, for example, that Lindau dies in the end, and this whole death is extremely complicated because some people said you have the polylogue, or you have the conversation between different social groups, and the fact that he eliminates Lindau shows that Howells has a very bourgeois attitude that tends towards the upper class, which may be possible, but maybe it's also a sign that he's fairly pessimistic about a possible dialogue across the whole scope of all of these social groups, including the immigrants. What is important about Lindau is that he's an immigrant, that he is poor, but that he is extremely well educated. He's a very intelligent man, and this is something that comes across very strongly in this book. So I think that is one of the main issues here. I don't know if Howells really wants to talk about the 48 revolution. I think that's too far away for him.
Yeah, but he makes him. He points this out expressly, that this man is a revolutionist from his own country. He's a Civil War veteran. He's lost the use of one of his arms in
Yes.
the Civil War. And now he's actually fighting for social rights and for labor rights. And in my first lecture here, I mentioned the importance of the labor struggle, in particularly for the whole period of literary realism and for this historical age. So, I mean, his sympathy, obvious sympathy with Lindau and with the striking workers, for all I remember, got Howells into trouble insofar as some of his more upper class backers and supporters now all of a sudden criticized him for being a sort of covert socialist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, exactly. No, you're absolutely right about that. Howells, to some extent, got in trouble there. It's very important. I forgot to mention that there's a big strike at the end, and this is actually where Lindau is killed by his clubbed to death by a policeman. You know, this is, by the way, another element, police violence. You know, this is another thing that basically rhymes totally with today's problems in the United States, which is why we should read this book. And we find all kinds of things that are déjà vu, you know, that are like old issues that Americans have already struggled with, you know, more than 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And they still don't have a solution for any of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have more questions materialized in the meantime? Sad to say this is not the case over here. Anybody who's possibly on Zoom online? Oh, here's a question. Maybe you come up here and ask the question directly, so I don't make a mess of it relating.
Hello.
Okay. So I was wondering, in regards to the whole Jeff Bezos and Washington Post relationship you've mentioned earlier in your presentation. Do occasions like this happen more often in the book, where you are concerned how the similarities between the economic decisions of rich people are in comparison to events happening in the book?
Yes, well, I just see this as a fact. You know, Howells basically said that there is this this super rich man, and we need money for this literary magazine, and we need a sponsor, and he just pays for it. There's no other way. That's Howells's imagination in the 1880s. That's how he sees it. What I think is interesting is that today, you know, if you look at the American press, you realize that newspapers become, in a sense, the toys of many rich people. And if we would like to make an accusation, as many people did, saying that Howells envisions this magazine of cooperation among different classes and groups and perspectives, this is a fake because ultimately it belongs to this super rich man. Of course, we can criticize that, but my point is that today's situation is not a whole lot better, and we still have a lot of big influential newspapers that are being owned by these robber barons. One of the things that I can tell you about is that when I started working on the late 19th century, I read a book called The Incorporation of America, which basically described, you know, how capitalism took over in the United States and what kind of an influence that all of this had on society. And that, you know, was in the 1990s. And when I read this book, you know, about the Gilded Age, you know, I certainly felt that the kind of Republican politics, you know, of neoliberalism and all that of my present period was exactly the same type of thing. And I was scared because you suddenly realize you have very similar cultural forces, economic forces that are active and dominating the United States. That is something interesting, and that's why it's very important to read literature from the Gilded Age, because it's so goddamn similar to the situation today. You know, I remember when the people started all praising all of these internet wizards, you know, these intelligent people who are bringing progress and digitalizing society. And as you know, nowadays, politicians want to have even more digitalization. Excellent, excellent, okay? But basically, the people who control it are in many ways the new robber barons, you know? So basically, if you've had a whole, you know, generation of plutocrats that basically, you know, came into being in the late 19th century, 100 years later, you have exactly the same situation, only that you have now the digital plutocrats who are basically controlling our economy, controlling our media, etc., etc., etc. So again, this is another reason why I think we should read some of this old realist literature again and very carefully.
Okay, thank you for this insightful answer.
You're welcome. What I would like to know from the audience is, you know, I'm unfortunately, I went through this much too fast, but you have these amazing catalogs of basically experiences that Basil and Isabel have when they are on the elevated train. They're looking at all of these houses and the windows and inside the apartments through the windows and all of that. And I'm sorry, but as I showed you, my association is a kind of modernist cubism. It's a cubist sort of broken up surface picture that they get. That was my association. And I have no idea if I'm totally wrong when I have this association. So I sort of wonder, you know, what you guys, what the audience thinks about that.
Well, we'll hear about that when they write their responses to the class, which, as you know, is the standard feature through which they also get their ECTS points in the end. So I'm looking forward to that response too. And as for the speed with which you went through the whole thing, I mean, by next week, this lecture will be up on the YouTube channel of the Carl-Schurz-Haus, so everybody can listen to it, look at it again in their own sweet time and at the speed rate that they choose themselves, which is one of the advantages of having digital lectures. So digitalization has its advantages and its disadvantages. And of course, the same thing holds true for ownership. I mean, this is exactly the period, as I said in the initial lecture, when people like Ochs and Pulitzer also own newspapers, but they use those newspapers for a more neutral, politically neutral form of reporting and for investigative journalism in a way that, and in a form that the United States hadn't known before either. I find the fact that we are returning to the point where a whole newspaper and can become the toy of an entrepreneur who, in some respects at least, doesn't seem to have grown beyond the age when you want to become an astronaut. You know, like Bezos and Elon Musk and other people. You know, the fact that somehow there are 5-year-olds, psychologically 5-year-olds at the moment at the helm of international corporations. That's more frightening than even people like Rupert Murdoch were, in a way. You know, you knew what you could expect from Murdoch, but somebody like Musk or Bezos can come up with is more like having Donald Trump as a president. So
yes.
The age of infantilism dawning on us all. Anyway, we're running out of time. Hearing your ideas about Howells and so on, I think the students will have made up their minds about why it is that the two of us are actually friends. And I hope that the next time round that we bring you in, maybe we can do it in person again. You'll be on again in January or February or early February with another talk about the damn tribe of scribbling women, volume 2.
I'll see what I can do. Let me see. I'm teaching on Thursday in Mulhouse, and I would probably have to take the car and try to come to Freiburg. Let's see what I can do.
That'd be brilliant if we could do that thing. And if
Yes.
not, we'll do it again this way. At the moment, you're kind of big brothering over me here in the background.
Okay.
I'll send you a photo of what that looked like.
I've never been on a big screen like that. I guess it's a really big one. I can imagine.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So
very impressive.
Thank you again very much, Selmi Ludwig, for your presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you for hosting me. You guys are wonderful. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Damaris, for being so patient with me. She's doing wonderful work.
No problem. It was a pleasure.